Imagine a desert horizon stretching endlessly under the burning sun. Now picture thousands of trucks lined up, their heavy engines rumbling, each one carrying a cargo of spoiled dragon fruit. One by one, the drivers unload the rotting red fruit into massive pits carved out of the sand. Within hours, 10,000 tons are buried, swallowed by the earth. To many watching, it feels like madness. In a nation where hunger is real, where families struggle every single day to put food on the table, how could anyone justify burying food, even if it has gone bad? The scene shocked the people of Burkina Faso. It shocked the world. Yet behind this strange and unsettling act stands one man, President Ibrahim Traoré. At just 36 years old, he has become one of Africa's youngest leaders, and also one of its most controversial. His decision was not simply about destroying rotten fruit. It was about the land itself. Traoré believes that the decaying fruit can give life back to the soil, a soil long stripped of its richness by drought and the relentless spread of the desert. In his vision, what seems like waste today could become the foundation of future harvests. But here is the real question. Will the people of Burkina Faso believe in this vision? Can they wait for results while they are hungry now? And for those of us watching from afar, especially here in America, what should we make of a leader who buries food in order to plant hope? Is this bold foresight or reckless gamble? As we explore this story, I want you to ask yourself, if you were standing there in that desert, watching thousands of tons of fruit vanish beneath the sand, would you see a tragedy or a promise? The story begins on the edge of the Sahel, where the desert has been creeping forward year after year, swallowing farmland, villages, and the hopes of countless families. It was here, under the burning African sun, that President Ibrahim Traoré ordered an extraordinary operation. Thousands of trucks, loaded with spoiled dragon fruit, were sent to the barren lands. The fruit was already rotten, unsellable, its sweet fragrance turned sour in the heat. But instead of letting it spread disease or pile up in useless heaps, Traoré had something different in mind. He wanted it buried. To the average citizen, the sight was almost unbearable. People stood near the fields of sand, their eyes wide as they watched load after load tumble into deep pits carved into the desert floor. The red flesh of the dragon fruit mixed with sand, forming grotesque rivers of color before disappearing beneath the bulldozers. For mothers and fathers struggling to feed their children, the sight of food, any food, being dumped into the earth was like a wound. Anger spread quickly. Some shouted that it was a crime. Others shook their heads in disbelief. How could a leader ask a hungry nation to watch food being destroyed? But Traoré was unmoved. He took to the national stage and explained himself with calm determination. The fruit, he said, was no longer fit to eat. It could not be sold, it could not be stored, and it carried the risk of disease. Yet he refused to see it as waste. Instead, he saw it as medicine for the soil. Burkina Faso, a country whose very survival depends on the land, has been losing that battle for decades. Each year the desert expands, stealing fertile ground. Each year farmers fight a little harder to coax life from the dust. By burying the dragon fruit, Traoré declared, he was feeding the land itself. This was not just disposal. It was a transformation. The rotting fruit, rich in organic matter, would decay further underground, seeping into the soil. Over time, that soil, once lifeless sand, could begin to hold nutrients again. The hope was that in a year or two, small crops could be planted where now only dust storms ruled. In 10 years, perhaps, green fields could return where only scorched earth remained. To Traoré, the burial was not a funeral. It was a planting. Still, for many ordinary people, this explanation was not enough. A woman in the crowd, holding her child, was reported to have said, "We are hungry today. We cannot wait for tomorrow." Her voice carried the frustration of thousands. They wanted answers for the present, not promises for the future. And yet some farmers quietly nodded. They had seen how compost could restore even the poorest patches of soil. They whispered that maybe, just maybe, the president was onto something bigger than anyone realized. International observers reacted with equal intensity. Journalists rushed to describe the scene. 10,000 tons of fruit vanishing into the earth. Headlines branded the decision as reckless, bizarre, or even cruel. But a few agricultural experts began to raise another view. To them, this was not madness. It was a calculated risk, a bold experiment in regenerative farming. In a world facing climate change and food insecurity, they argued, perhaps it takes such unconventional steps to find new answers. For Traore, the burial of the dragon fruit was a statement of defiance against the desert, against despair, and against the idea that Africa must always follow the solutions of others. He wanted the world to see that even spoiled fruit could become the seed of a better future. Whether his people would agree was another matter entirely. The climax of this story came on a blistering afternoon when the final convoys of trucks rolled across the desert plain. News cameras captured the moment as bulldozers pushed the last mountains of spoiled dragon fruit into the earth. The sheer volume was staggering. 10,000 tons, enough to fill entire warehouses, enough to feed entire towns if only it had been fresh, now disappeared beneath layers of sand. For many who watched, it was not just fruit being buried. It felt like hope itself was being lowered into the ground. Crowds of onlookers gathered at the edges of the operation. Some shouted angrily, their voices raw with despair. They called it a crime against the hungry, a mistake no leader should ever make. Elderly men shook their heads in disbelief, while women clutched their children, unable to hide their tears. For them, food was too precious to watch vanish, even if rotten. Each load of fruit thudding into the pits felt like a personal insult, as if the government had chosen symbolism over survival. Yet not everyone was outraged. Among the murmurs of discontent, there were also voices of cautious support. A farmer from the Sahel region, his face lined with years of toil, whispered to a reporter that he understood. He had seen what compost could do, how waste turned into life. To him, the burial was not destruction but preparation. His words carried a quiet wisdom. Sometimes you must give back to the earth before it can give back to you. That sentiment, though rare in the moment, planted a different kind of seed in the minds of those willing to listen. The images quickly spread far beyond Burkina Faso. Within hours, international media outlets seized upon the story. Headlines painted it as a spectacle. President orders fruit burial in desert. 10,000 tons of food dumped in Africa. Bold strategy or reckless waste? Social media amplified the outrage, with thousands of comments condemning the decision as cruel and irresponsible. For much of the global audience, the sight of wasted food was unbearable, especially in a world where millions still go hungry. But as the days passed, the tone began to shift. Agricultural experts, environmental scientists, and climate activists joined the conversation. Some defended Traoré's decision, noting that regenerative agriculture often requires acts of patience and sacrifice. They pointed out that organic matter could indeed restore desert soils, a practice not unlike composting on a massive scale. In their eyes, the burial was not lunacy, but an experiment worth watching. Traoré himself leaned into this narrative. In a national address broadcast on radio and television, he spoke not with apology, but with conviction. He told his people that he understood their pain, that he knew hunger was real and urgent. But he urged them to see beyond the present moment. The land must be fed so that tomorrow's children will eat, he declared. His words struck a chord with some, but for many, they fell flat. The empty stomach speaks louder than promises of fertile soil years from now. Still, the speech added to the growing debate around the world. Was this a display of visionary leadership? A young president daring to challenge both the desert and traditional thinking? Or was it an act of desperation? A gamble that risked alienating the very people he sought to serve. In the end, the burial of the dragon fruit became more than just an agricultural decision. It became a test of faith. Faith in a leader, faith in a future not yet seen, and faith that sacrifice today could bring abundance tomorrow. Some saw tragedy, others saw promise. But no one could deny that the image of crimson fruit sinking into desert sand had etched itself permanently into the memory of a nation and into the eyes of the world. When the bulldozers had gone silent and the last trucks drove away, The pits were sealed beneath layers of desert sand. But the echoes of that moment carried far beyond the burial grounds. In the villages and towns of Burkina Faso, the conversation grew louder, sharper, and more divided. For ordinary citizens, the sight of so much food disappearing underground left deep emotional scars. To many, it became a symbol of neglect. Mothers spoke of their children going to bed hungry, while fathers questioned why the government had not found another use for the fruit: feeding livestock, producing fertilizer, or even distributing it earlier before it spoiled. For them, the burial was not renewed. It was a loss. In local markets, whispers turned into heated debates. Some vendors, already struggling with inflation and shortages, accused the government of caring more about experiments than about people. Others, often farmers familiar with soil and its stubborn resistance, offered a more patient view. They argued that the fruit was not food anymore. It was fertilizer, and if the land could be revived, the benefit would be far greater than a temporary distribution of spoiled fruit. But patience is difficult to ask of a nation where hunger is a daily struggle. Politically, the event gave both fuel and fire to opposing camps. Critics of Ibrahim Traoré seized the moment. They painted him as reckless, a leader willing to gamble with symbolism while his people suffered. In speeches and pamphlets, they framed the burial as proof that he was out of touch, more concerned with appearances than with immediate needs. In some corners, the event even sparked small protests, where citizens demanded accountability and alternatives to what they called wasteful leadership. Yet among his supporters, the burial was reframed as an act of courage. They emphasized his youth, his willingness to try bold solutions in a world where traditional methods had failed. To them, Traoré's decision symbolized independence and defiance, not only against the desert, but also against the patterns of dependency that had long tied African nations to foreign aid and external control. By choosing to invest in the soil rather than beg for handouts, they argued, he was trying to build lasting strength. The divide was not just political, but generational. Younger activists and farmers were more willing to experiment, to trust that regenerative practices could offer a path forward. Older citizens who had lived through years of broken promises were less forgiving. They wanted food on the table today, not theories of fertile fields tomorrow. This tension created a fragile atmosphere where hope and skepticism clashed in every conversation. Within the government itself, the burial sparked debate. Advisors argued over whether the move had been worth the backlash. Some believed the negative press would weaken Burkina Faso's position internationally, portraying the country as unstable or irrational. Others insisted that the long-term benefits would outweigh the criticism, and that history would vindicate Traoré if the desert lands indeed began to bloom again. Meanwhile, civil society organizations grew more vocal. Humanitarian groups criticized the government for not consulting them, for not exploring other ways to use the fruit before it spoiled. Agricultural unions, however, quietly admitted that the science behind the burial had merit, even if the execution and communication were clumsy. The mixed reactions reflected the uncertainty of a nation caught between immediate survival and long-term strategy. For the ordinary citizen, the burial became part of daily storytelling. In coffee stalls, at water wells, in evening gatherings under the trees, people debated whether the president was visionary or foolish. Some claimed he was planting for the future. Others feared he was burying their trust along with the fruit. In the weeks that followed, no one could say for certain who was right. But one truth was undeniable. The burial of 10,000 tons of dragon fruit had become more than an agricultural act. It was now a political earthquake, shaking the confidence of a nation and testing the fragile balance between hope and hunger, between leadership and legitimacy. The land might recover in time. Whether the trust of the people would recover as well, that remained the far greater question. From across the Atlantic, the images of dragon fruit tumbling into desert pits reached living rooms in America. For older Americans especially, the sight carried a strange familiarity. Many remembered stories from the Great Depression, when the U.S. government ordered crops destroyed and livestock slaughtered in order to stabilize collapsing markets. Back then, it was a strategy born of desperation, one that sparked outrage but also paved the way for agricultural reforms that eventually fed generations. The burial in Burkina Faso, though half a world away, seemed to echo that painful chapter of American history. Analysts in Washington framed Traoré's decision through different lenses. Some foreign policy experts warned that such dramatic experiments could undermine stability, making Burkina Faso look unpredictable to potential allies and investors. Others, however, noted that his willingness to challenge convention might mark him as a new kind of African leader, bold, independent, and unwilling to simply follow the patterns set by Western donors. For the United States, this raised an uncomfortable question. Should America see Traoré as a partner worth supporting, or as a risk best kept at arm's length? Agricultural experts in international forums offered a more technical perspective. They pointed out that regenerative farming, composting, and soil enrichment are well-established practices, though rarely attempted at such scale. They argued that if Traoré's experiments succeeded, it could serve as a model for other nations facing desertification and climate stress. In an era when food security is increasingly fragile, they saw in Burkina Faso not just a local story, but a potential blueprint for survival. Still, humanitarian organizations expressed frustration. To them, the burial symbolized mismanagement. They argued that earlier intervention, better storage, improved transport, or timely distribution could have saved much of the fruit before it rotted. For global charities working to feed Africa's hungry, the event was a reminder that leadership choices can mean the difference between waste and survival. Among the American public, the story struck a deeper, more emotional chord. For many seniors, it raised timeless questions about trust in leadership and the burden of sacrifice. Was Ibrahim Traoré a visionary planting for tomorrow, or a reckless gambler asking his people to endure needless suffering today? And if America were in his shoes, would we have the courage or the recklessness to do the same? The image of 10,000 tons of dragon fruit buried beneath desert sand will linger for years to come. For some, it will always stand as a symbol of waste, a cruel reminder of hunger in a nation that could not afford it. For others, it will remain a bold act of defiance, a gamble against the desert itself, an attempt to plant hope where only dust had ruled. What cannot be denied is that this single decision has shaken Burkina Faso, divided its people, and drawn the eyes of the world to a young president who refuses to follow the usual script. In the end, the story is not just about spoiled fruit. It is about leadership, trust, and the balance between short-term survival and long-term vision. President Ibrahim Traoré has asked his people to believe in a future they cannot yet see, to accept sacrifice today for the promise of fertile soil tomorrow. That is no small request. For a nation already scarred by poverty and uncertainty, the burden of patience weighs heavily. And for those of us watching from afar, it forces us to ask what we value most in leadership. Is it immediate relief, or the courage to take risks that might only bear fruit years later? Perhaps the real question is not whether the dragon fruit will transform the desert, but whether Ibrahim Traoré can transform the faith of his people. Can he sustain their trust long enough to prove that this gamble was not folly, but foresight? Or will the burial of the fruit become a burial of confidence, marking a turning point where the people of Burkina Faso decide they can no longer wait? Now I want to hear from you. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective, or is he asking too much of a hungry nation? Can we continue to trust him to lead Burkina Faso through sacrifice into strength? Or should the world prepare for someone else to step forward? Please share this video if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe that truth and context matter more than headlines. Together, we can keep these stories alive and give voice to the struggles and the hopes that shape the future of Africa.